The fluorescent lights of the archive office hummed with a monotonous efficiency, a sound Blake found reassuring. Each file cabinet, each shelf, each meticulously labeled box represented an anchor in a world otherwise prone to entropy. Blake ran a gloved finger along the spine of a ledger marked Transits, Q3, 1987, its cover worn smooth by decades of handling, before slotting it precisely into its designated space. Order was paramount, a sacred principle in the administrative annex of the border checkpoint. Their work was a silent ballet of classification and retrieval, a constant battle against the encroaching chaos of uncatalogued information. Today's task involved processing a forgotten consignment of confiscated items, long since cleared of legal dispute but never properly integrated into the historical record. The customs officer, a burly figure with perpetually tired eyes, had wheeled in a cart laden with dusty boxes earlier that morning. Most contained mundane objects, old watches, foreign currency long out of circulation, a handful of poorly preserved maps. Blake approached the final box, a plain cardboard container marked only with a faded, illegible customs stamp. They carefully sliced the tape with a utility knife, the sound a crisp tear in the quiet air. Inside, nestled amongst brittle newspaper clippings and a few tarnished medallions, lay an object that immediately caught Blake's attention. It was small, no larger than a clenched fist, and perfectly black. Not the matte black of obsidian, nor the reflective sheen of polished jet, but a profound, absolute black that seemed to absorb the room's artificial light without reflection. Its surface was smooth, almost oily to the touch, yet entirely dry. It possessed an unnatural density, far heavier than its size suggested, and felt subtly cool against the latex glove. Blake lifted it out, rotating it slowly. There were no discernible markings, no seams, no imperfections. It was a perfect ovoid, featureless and silent. The customs officer had long since departed, leaving Blake alone with the object and the hum of the lights. Blake's meticulous training screamed for identification. Every item had a provenance, a record, a classification code. This had none. They cross-referenced the consignment manifest. Blank. Checked the customs seizure logs for the corresponding date. Nothing. It simply was. A faint, almost imperceptible pressure began to build behind Blake's eyes. It wasn't pain, not precisely, but a subtle distortion, as if the air itself had thickened around the object. Blake set it down on a clean sheet of archival paper, a stark contrast against its profound darkness. They felt a strange compulsion to touch it directly, to peel away the glove and feel its true texture. Professionalism warred with an unsettling curiosity. The object radiated an inexplicable stillness, a quiet intensity that defied explanation. Blake found their gaze continually drawn back to it. The careful sorting of the remaining clippings became a secondary task, their attention fracturing. They picked up a magnifying glass, scrutinizing the object's surface, searching for a seam, a scratch, anything to betray its origin. There was nothing. It was flawless. Yet, as Blake peered closer, a peculiar sensation began to manifest. The edges of their vision seemed to waver, the sharp lines of the archive shelves momentarily blurring, then snapping back into focus. A fleeting dizziness, like standing up too quickly, washed over them. This wasn't fatigue. Blake had worked longer shifts with fewer breaks. This was different. A creeping unease settled in, a cold finger tracing the back of their neck. It spoke of things that did not belong, of orders that were meant to be broken. Blake reached for the logbook, intending to make a provisional entry, to mark it as unidentified object, consignment 7B. But as their hand hovered over the page, the pen felt heavy, alien. The familiar lines of the ledger seemed to shift, the black ink of previous entries appearing to crawl, to ride just at the periphery of their sight. Blake blinked, hard. The lines were still, the ink fixed. It was merely a trick of the light, a consequence of staring too long at the featureless blackness. They told themselves this, but the conviction felt thin, brittle. The office was quiet, save for the hum. Blake was alone with the object. A decision formed, a professional imperative layered with a nascent, unsettling fascination. This anomaly could not remain uncatalogued. It demanded investigation, demanded understanding. They would take it to their private workspace, a small, secure area usually reserved for sensitive documents. There, away from casual observation, they could dedicate the necessary time to unravel its mystery. Blake carefully placed the object into a padded, secure case, the profound blackness seeming to settle even deeper within the confines of the protective foam. The subtle pressure behind their eyes intensified, a quiet, persistent throb. The first seed of unease had taken root. Blake ran a gloved finger along the spine of a ledger marked Traversal Records. The worn leather felt oddly warm beneath the cotton. The ledger was heavier than it looked, its pages thick, almost fibrous. Blake settled at their usual desk, the silence of the late hour broken only by the distant thrum of the building's ventilation system. They carefully opened the book. Instead of neat columns of dates and destinations, the first few pages were filled with sprawling, elegant script that detailed not journeys, but sensations. Descriptions of light that didn't adhere to any known spectrum, of echoes from sounds that never truly ceased, of textures that felt simultaneously rough and impossibly smooth. The language was precise, clinical, yet utterly alien in its subject matter. Blake's brow furrowed. This was no standard archival document. One entry described the slow seep of the crimson hue into the periphery of all vision, a persistent, silent encroachment, followed by a date from the early 1900s and a series of geometric symbols Blake had never encountered in any historical text. Another spoke of the resonance of 1,000 voices, yet no discernible word, vibrating within the bone, a deep, internal hum that preceded the shift. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil. Blake ignored calls from colleagues, dismissed the suggestions of a break from the archive supervisor. Sleep became a luxury they couldn't afford. The ledger was a gravitational pull, each page a new, unsettling revelation. They cross-referenced its peculiar entries with other forgotten documents, maps depicting coastlines that diverged subtly from modern geography, reports of inexplicable atmospheric phenomena filed under miscellaneous oddities, even a collection of photographs showing distorted figures in familiar urban landscapes, dismissed as photographic anomalies. The connections began to form a mosaic of impossibility. The geometric symbols in the ledger reappeared in the margins of a 19th-century maritime chart, marking points where ships had vanished without a trace. The crimson hue was mentioned in a forgotten meteorological log from an abandoned coastal station, describing an unrecorded atmospheric event. Blake felt a cold clarity settle over them, sharpening their focus even as the edges of their own reality began to fray. They saw patterns, undeniable and terrifying, where before there had only been disparate data points. Headaches became a constant companion, a dull ache behind the eyes that intensified when Blake stared too long at the ledger's strange script. The archive, once a sanctuary of order, began to feel like a cage. The hum of the lights seemed to pulse, and sometimes, in the deep quiet of the night, Blake could almost hear the faint, internal hum described in the ledger, a vibration deep within their own skull. They began to question the validity of their own perceptions, pinching their arm, rubbing their temples, trying to ground themselves. Was this the exhaustion, the isolation, or something far more insidious? A specific entry in the traversal records caught Blake's attention, its script slightly bolder, underlined with a jagged stroke: observation point, border checkpoint, sector Gamma 7. Persistent atmospheric distortion. Entry point confirmed. The date was recent, disturbingly so, barely a month old. Blake stared at the words, a knot forming in their stomach. Sector Gamma 7 corresponded to a well-known, active land crossing. The decision was immediate, propelled by a desperate need for tangible proof, for an anchor to the world they thought they knew. Blake secured the ledger, locking it away, a tremor in their hands. They informed the archive supervisor of an urgent need to verify a historical land claim, a flimsy excuse that felt paper-thin even to them. The supervisor, a harried individual focused solely on quotas, merely nodded. The drive to the border checkpoint was a blur of highway and muted sunlight. The mundane landscape felt strangely vibrant, almost hyper-real, as if Blake's senses had been recalibrated by the ledger's influence. Vehicles idled in neat queues, exhaust fumes hanging heavy in the air. Blake approached the main building, presenting their identification to a uniformed officer at the entrance. Archival research, Blake stated, their voice steady despite the internal tremor. Verifying a property line dispute. The officer, a burly figure with a vacant stare, grunted and waved them through to a small, cluttered records office. Inside, a clerk with tired eyes sat behind a counter, shuffling through stacks of paperwork. "What can I do for you?" the clerk asked. Not looking up. "I need to review any records pertaining to atmospheric anomalies or unusual activity reports from the last 6 months." Blake requested, trying to keep their tone neutral. Specifically, anything referencing sector Gamma 7 or unusual visual distortions. The clerk paused, slowly lifting their head. Their eyes, a pale, startling blue, met Blake's. Some things just are not. The clerk's gaze lingered for a beat too long, an unreadable depth in their expression. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, they pushed a thick, unbound folder across the counter. Its cover was blank. Blake opened it, their breath catching. Inside, amongst official reports of vehicle inspections and cargo manifests, was a single, crudely drawn sketch. It depicted a series of geometric symbols identical to those in the traversal records ledger, superimposed over a distorted, almost liquid rendering of the border checkpoint's main tower. Beneath it, written in a shaky hand, was a single word: threshold. The fluorescent lights of the records office flickered, plunging the room into momentary gloom before snapping back on. Blake gripped the folder, their knuckles white. The internal hum intensified, a deep, pervasive vibration that seemed to emanate not from outside, but from the very core of their being. The world shifted around them, the air thickening, the clerk's pale eyes seeming to expand, to encompass everything. Blake knew, with an absolute, terrifying certainty, that they were no longer merely observing, they were becoming part of the traversal. The internal hum, once a subtle vibration, now resonated through Blake's bones, a constant, low thrum that had guided them through the city's desolate outskirts. It pulsed in their teeth, behind their eyes, a relentless current pulling them towards the designated coordinates. The records office, the flickering lights, the folder, all faded into a distant, irrelevant memory, replaced by the immediate, overwhelming certainty of their destination, the border checkpoint. Blake arrived as a pale, pre-dawn light began to seep into the sky, painting the eastern horizon in bruised purples and grays. The border checkpoint stood like a skeletal sentinel against the emerging light. Concrete barriers, stained with what looked like ancient grime, formed a labyrinthine approach. Empty booths with shattered windows stared out like vacant eyes. A rusted metal gate, half ajar, creaked faintly in. The imperceptible breeze. No guards, no vehicles, only the vast, silent expanse of scrubland beyond. The air was still, heavy with an unnatural quiet that swallowed the faint crunch of Blake's shoes on the gravel. He clutched the folder tighter. Its contents, the strange symbols and disjointed narratives, now seemed less like a mystery to be solved and more like an instruction manual for an awakening. The hum intensified, no longer an external force, but an internal resonance, a frequency matching something deeper within Blake. His breath caught in his throat. He pushed through the creaking gate, stepping onto the cracked asphalt of the checkpoint's main thoroughfare. The ground felt wrong, not just uneven, but subtly yielding, as if the very pavement exhaled under his weight. He looked down, seeing the cracks shift and reform into intricate, organic patterns that pulsed with a faint, self-generated light. He blinked, and they were just cracks again, but the memory of their momentary vibrancy lingered, a chill tracing his spine. The fluorescent lights in the empty inspection canopy overhead flickered, not with a mechanical fault, but with an impossible, rhythmic pattern that echoed the hum in his head. They cast long, dancing shadows that stretched and contracted, mimicking the movements of unseen entities. Blake's grip on the folder tightened until his knuckles were white, the paper crinkling under the pressure. He felt a profound disorientation, a sense that the checkpoint was not a static structure, but a living, breathing thing, its existence defined by the very act of its perceived observation. The air grew heavy, thick with an odor like ozone and wet earth, mixed with something else, something metallic and ancient that made Blake's teeth ache. He felt a pressure building in his skull, as if his mind were expanding, struggling to contain an influx of information too vast, too alien. He stopped directly beneath the canopy, the hum now a deafening roar within his ears, yet utterly silent to the outside world. He opened the folder, its pages feeling strangely warm against his fingertips. He focused on a particular diagram, a complex, non-Euclidean structure that had previously defied any logical interpretation. Reveal/discovery. As Blake stared, the lines of the diagram detached themselves from the page, shimmering into the air before him. The border checkpoint, the asphalt, the distant scrubland, all became translucent, overlaid by this new, impossible geometry. He saw through the familiar, mundane reality. What lay beneath was not bedrock or soil, but a vast, undulating expanse of something formless and immense, a cosmic organism of unthinkable scale. The hum was not just an internal sensation, but the sound of this colossal entity breathing, its vastness pressing against the veil of human perception. Reality fractured. The ground beneath Blake's feet did not merely undulate, it folded in on itself, defying gravity and logic. The inspection canopy overhead warped into a spiraling vortex of light and impossible angles. The distant horizon curved inward, revealing not the expected sky, but a swirling maelstrom of colors that had no name, shifting and coalescing into patterns that were both terrifyingly beautiful and utterly incomprehensible. His mind screamed, not in fear, but in recognition. He wasn't deciphering the artifact was deciphering him, unlocking the innate capacity to perceive what had always been there, just beyond the edge of human sensory input. He was not merely witnessing a manifestation, he was becoming a part of it. The hum resonated with every cell, every molecule of his being, a symphony of cosmic vibration. The barrier between him and it dissolved. The horror was not an external entity to be confronted, but the fundamental truth of existence, a vast, indifferent consciousness that encompassed all things, including Blake. He was a ripple in its immense, incomprehensible thought. The folder slipped from his nerveless fingers, scattering its pages across the impossible ground. Blake stood suspended in the heart of this revelation, his body trembling, his mind irrevocably shattered and remade. The world had not ended, it had simply revealed its true, terrifying face. And in that face, Blake saw not an enemy, but an infinite, terrifying reflection of himself. The hum was now his own pulse, his own thought, vibrating with the silent, terrible song of the universe.